Hi, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. I'm really excited to be here. I just did the same presentation virtually, and I was like, oh, what do you think about this? And then I couldn't hear anyone's actual responses because it's, a chat. And so I'm really excited to be here with all of you in person and to share a little bit of what I've learned in my research and to hopefully offer up a framework that will be supportive of whatever diversity, equity, inclusion work you're doing in your own context. I imagine that you're all doing a variety of things. And again, I hope that this time together is just supportive of whatever that is. So I've got a good bit of ground to cover and a relatively short period of time, so I'm going to dive in. As Caroline shared, I am the founder of the Diversity Gap, which now is a coaching and facilitation practice for race-conscious leaders and teams. And my work is really to support leaders and teams as they seek to really embody their values for racial justice and racial equity. I like to come alongside them at different points in their journey, whether that's through a one-on-one conversation, a facilitated workshop for their whole team, coaching executive leaders, whatever it might be. And the research and the content I'm going to share today came from a multi-year research project I did, interviewing hundreds of leaders and organizations about their unique diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges. So I have a question that I want to ask all of you, and I'm hoping for real engagement, because like you heard, I didn't have as much engagement virtually because of the nature of the platform. But I'd love to hear what these words mean to you, because they mean a lot of different things, which we're going to get into now. But when you hear diversity, when you hear equity, when you hear inclusion, when you hear justice, what's the general mood? Are we into this? Are we not? Are we over it? What do you think? Tell me your thoughts. What do these words mean to you? Inconsistent, yes. Mm. Mm-hmm. And everybody had the opportunity to get it. Mm-hmm. And somebody was on a step stool, somebody was on a ladder. Yes. So it was different ways of getting it. I thought it was a great way of describing what each of these terms were. Mm-hmm. Using a visual. Yes, that's great. I've seen not that one, but similar ones where, or I've seen also where you're like running a race or doing a race and there are different size shoes and there's lots of different ways people communicate that idea, but I think those visuals are very, very effective. Yes.
I think of intentionality or the lack of intentionality.
Okay, intentionality or the lack thereof. Great. Yes. Great.
I think tension, challenge,
Tension, challenge, bias. Great.
Sometimes I think sadness only because it's still happening.
Yeah. Sadness. Absolutely. I heard someone over here.
I think of frustration.
Frustration. Yeah. It was someone else?
That's a trend or trending.
Yes. Trending. Very true. Very good. Lots of head nods on that one. Yeah, these words mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I'm imagining or guessing that you all are in some sort of leadership capacity or position of influence within your organization. And so I'm imagining, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that these words or these ideas have come up for you over the last few years as you're leading. And what I've learned in interacting with leaders like yourselves is that just because we're using the same words doesn't mean we mean the same thing. Even something as simple as someone inviting me in to do a training, I talk to their head of HR, they say, hey, we're doing this training. And then I talk to their executive level leader and they'll tell me their goal. We want our culture to be X, Y, and Z. Then I talk to their executive leader and they're saying, we just need more people of color here. Then I talk to a person of color who's entry level and they're saying, I hate it here. I'm experiencing all of these microaggressions. And so what I've learned is that as organizations go on these DEI journeys, they're actually all talking about different things, even though they're using similar words. And the framework that I'm going to share, I'm hoping it will help parse out some of those things as you are trying to make decisions in your own context. And along with that, our visions are success for varied. I kind of just made this point, but our ideas of what success looks like, it's all over the map. Now, as I get into the content, I do always like to offer up some supportive practices because talking about race from all of our different backgrounds and experiences, it's going to land on us differently, and I don't want to assume. And so here are a few practices to keep in mind now and in general. Number one is to listen to your body. This one's often it's often missed, I want to say, but is your heart racing? Are you getting hot? Is your leg doing the thing, How is your body doing? Do you need to breathe? Do you need to step out of the room? Do you need a sip of water? Pay attention to how you feel, and I would just want to encourage you to take care of yourself as best you can. Number 2 is to be willing to think and do things differently. I'm going to share some ideas that you may love, you might hate them, but I would encourage you to be open-minded and to see how they might help you in your context. Number 3 is to embrace discomfort. And I like to encourage people to think or to remember that discomfort's not always the same as pain. I think of exercising, I think of yoga as like at one point the stretch is good for you. If you go too far, it's actually bad for you. So try to pay attention to, hey, is this just uncomfortable or is this painful? And try to sort that out as best you can. Number 4 is to expect and accept non-closure. I love closure. I want a tidy little bow on everything, but we're not going to solve racism today in the next 30 minutes. And so expect and accept non-closure. And then number 5 is to use the language you have. When we all come to these conversations, we have different levels of interaction with these themes. And so I just want to encourage you, you don't have to have the perfect words. It's okay if you have to fumble over it. Use the language that you have, and we'll get to the other side together. Now, diversity to equity, a framework. I'm going to just dive in. Here's the framework. It's a very simple idea. I like to think about diversity to equity as an iceberg. And someone spoke to this earlier. Diversity is at the top of the iceberg. It's above the water. It's what you can see. As you get a little bit deeper into the work, you hit inclusion and reconciliation. And then if you're operating at the base of this iceberg, this is where we're really talking about liberation, equity, and justice. When I define diversity, there's lots of definitions out there. I want to offer up this one. I'm thinking of the state of having multiple races, ethnicities, genders, religious identities, abilities, ages, nationalities, and cultural perspectives on your team. It's a state of being. You can be diverse or not diverse, just based on the bodies who are in the room. And when leaders are operating primarily in the diversity frame, I have found that their solutions are in these buckets. They tend to be very tactical solutions. If we move this and move that, then we'll have a more diverse organization. In this frame, there's often a focus on what you can see and on what you can measure. It's at the top of the iceberg. And then it also tends to be very data-driven. Things you might hear leaders say when operating in this frame. Success is representation. This is the goal. You might hear phrases like, we need to diversify our team, or diversity is good business, one I hear all the time. Diverse teams outperform homogenous teams, which is actually only true in very specific circumstances. There's the idea that we need to restructure our pipeline. I hear that phrase a lot. And then this idea that representation matters. So these are the things people might say when operating in this diversity frame. Vehicles that organizations often leverage in this frame is hosting implicit bias trainings, educational workshops, so moments like this, adjusting the hiring pipeline, I alluded to that. Launching employee resource groups is one vehicle that's leveraged within this frame. Creating diversity task forces is another, and then lastly, diversifying your network. So these are some of the levers you can pull if you're seeking to increase representation in your organization. Now, there are a couple of gaps that I want to offer up here. I have found that the strategies for diversity are often decontextualized, and here's what I mean by that. People will say, oh, this group is underrepresented on a team, but they won't acknowledge, oh, this group has been historically excluded on our team, and that there's a big difference between those two things. And so when we're only talking about diversity, we have to acknowledge the extent to which we're really considering the context of the problem. How did we get here? And when people often jump to adjusting the hiring pipeline or to some of the tactics of making those changes, they're often decontextualized from history, from place. And so it's really important to acknowledge that. The second gap here is that it's really easy to begin commodifying people with marginalized identities. And I'm going to share a quote to illustrate this point. This was said by Xavier Ramey, who's the founder of a consultancy in Chicago called Justice Informed. And he said this on an event that I was hosting a few years ago, and it really challenged me, and so I use it all the time. He says, I appreciate the business case for diversity. I challenge it. You see, there was a business case for feeding your slaves twice a day, too. They work harder. You get more out of them. More innovations on the plantation. It's chattel diversity. It doesn't mean you actually think they're human. It doesn't mean you know how to respect them. It doesn't mean you understand dignity. It means you have once again subjected a human to be valued on the basis of their productive capacity for you. Yes. His words say enough. And so this is one of the biggest challenges of operating primarily, if not exclusively, in the we need to diversify our team frame. Okay, let's see, I'll let you take a picture though. It's like, I don't want to move on just yet, okay. Okay, so a little bit deeper into the iceberg, we hit inclusion and reconciliation, and here are a couple of definitions. The ongoing process of cultivating authentic and mutually dignifying relationships among diverse groups of people. And then another way to define it is a felt sense of empowerment and belonging. And for empowerment, I put the ability to define reality, the ability to define what's happening, to set the terms of engagement. These are definitions I use for this particular part of the framework. Within the inclusion and reconciliation frame, the focus tends to be very relational. We all need to get along, let's be friends. There tends to be a focus on strengthening communication in this frame, and then there also tends to be a big focus on intercultural competency. So how do we understand each other, how do we relate, how do we connect is really important. It's not just about getting the bodies in the room, but it's about being able to build meaningful relationships once we're in the room. Some things we might say within this frame is that success is belonging and authentic connection. And so some of the lines I've heard, relationships are fractured along racial lines. People might say our world is broken and in need of restoration. People might believe that restoring relationships is what will heal society within this frame. We need to better understand one another is a big priority in this frame. And there's also this idea that let's just talk this thing out. There's a big emphasis on dialogue within this frame as well. Some of the vehicles that leaders use when they're operating primarily in the inclusion frame is dialogues. So space is not just to learn something, but to really engage with one another. Facilitated workshops and training, so it's not just someone talking to you, but it's someone facilitating an experience where you're able to build understanding with one another. Conflict mediation, storytelling and story listening is big in this frame. Empathy building is really big in this frame. And then also building, again, cultural competency. There are a few gaps in this frame as well. Number one is that it doesn't address systems, which we're gonna get into in a second. Progress is really difficult to measure. How do you really measure if someone feels like they belong? You can ask them, but if there's a strange power dynamic, you might not get the truth. And so how do you really measure the extent to which someone feels like they're included in something? Someone might have an answer to that question. If you do, let me know, I'm curious. Last but not least, it's really emotionally draining. To have all of these heart-to-heart, let me tell you my story conversations, especially at work, is really, really tiring. And so as leaders, if you are activating these vehicles within the inclusion frame, you have to think a lot about recovery, about rest, about care, because sharing your story and trying to build meaningful connection just takes a lot of time and can be exhausting. And so at the base of the iceberg here, we have liberation, equity, and justice. Really big words, really big ideas that I don't have time to give all the care that they each need. But some simple definitions are, number one, freedom from oppressive systems, stories, habits, policies, and practices. Number two is no longer being able to determine outcomes based on identity. So that's really speaking to that equity piece. And then number three is speaking to the justice piece, which is creating cultures of collective healing and repair. And I know I'm moving through all of these things pretty quickly, so if you have any questions, let me know. And we have time for that at the end as well. When I talk about oppressive systems, I also like to frame it as systems of domination because they land differently in different people's brains, and I want to make it as accessible as possible. But there are a few, or five that I have listed here, systems of domination to keep in mind when we're thinking about the liberation, equity, and justice frame. So number one is race-based domination. So that would be white supremacy, at least in the US context. Number two is gender-based domination. So we're talking about patriarchy. Number three is religious-based domination, which is Christian hegemony or hegemony. I never know how you say it. And this actually has nothing to do with like a personal belief system. It speaks to the ways in which Christianity as the dominant religion sets the standard for who belongs and who doesn't belong in a given space. Number four is domination based on sexual orientation, so heterosexism. And then number five is land-based domination, so imperialism and settler colonialism. And so when we say freedom from systems, this is what we're talking about. Liberation, equity, and justice are about upending, reimagining, and repairing the harm caused by these systems of domination. That's what these things are about. Now, within the liberation frame, it's different than the inclusion frame and very different than the diversity frame. We're really focused on systemic changes and like what's the collective responsible for here and how do we move towards change together. Within this frame, there's a big focus on transformation. So it's not just relationships, it's not just A plus B equals C, it's like how do we really change who we are as leaders, who we are as an organization, and collectively who we are as a society as a whole. And there's also a big emphasis in this frame on redistributing power. Things we might say in this frame is that success is equity. That's what it is. When equity is achieved, we've been successful. It's felt freedom, and it's also social justice. And what I found in working with organizations that have been founded with the liberation frame as their priority, I find that they also get everything else up the iceberg. You get the representation, you get the belonging, you get the authentic connection when you prioritize what's at the base of the iceberg. So things leaders might say in this frame is, we don't have a diversity problem, we have a racism problem. Those are two different things. In this frame, you might say systems of domination must be named and disrupted. We can't just pretend like they're not here. We have to articulate what's happening and how is it happening and why. In this frame, leaders say repair requires redistribution of power and material resources. It's not just about your intentions, it's about people's lived experiences. And then lastly, our challenges are systemic and must be addressed systemically in this frame. Some of the vehicles, and this list isn't exhaustive, but some of the vehicles that leaders leverage in this frame is political activism and policy changes, accountability, grappling with history in a way that's real, reparations, art and creativity, and then I put therapy and mental health care because that's what helps me navigate some of these systems as an individual. So these are some of the vehicles. Now, there are a few gaps organizationally to this frame. I wanted to be honest about this. It's really difficult to operationalize, track, quantify, and measure. And I find that this is the case because when we talk about equity, not one organization can fix it. You know, it's a collective problem, so it takes collective impact to make a difference. So it's really difficult to track, quantify, and measure. I find that the journey is often inefficient and it's not quite as linear as maybe diversity seems to be. And then I also find that this work is deeply personal. And so there has to be decisions made about how much of myself do I want to bring to my workplace to advocate for these kinds of changes. So it's very, very personal work. And so here's the framework overall. What I'm going to do now is walk through a quick case study from a nonprofit organization that I've journeyed with for a while, and then we'll land the plane with some questions. So here's the case study from one organization. This is really small, I'm saying now, but I will read most of it, so sorry about that. In 2012, this particular organization, so 10 years ago now, they had an all-white staff, an all-white and all-male board, and it was a nearly, from my observation, a nearly all-white organization. Most of the leaders of color that participated didn't stay in any meaningful way, and they weren't experiencing, didn't have access to any levels of leadership in this organization. At this time, 2012, there was a training that began operating regularly on building dignified, interdependent relationships. And I think this is interesting because it wasn't a training on racial justice, it wasn't a training on identity at all. It was about how do we build meaningful relationships across lines of difference broadly. And I think that set a really good foundation for the work that we would do later. At this point in time, the leaders did begin being more intentional about diversifying their event stages, which was one of the main ways that the public was able to interact with the organization. And then there was also a concerted effort specifically to begin relationship building with Black-led organizations in the community. This was an Atlanta-based organization, and so that was a relevant decision to focus on relationship building with Black-led organizations. Fast forward 3 years, things changed a good bit, actually. The staff and community was about 20% in terms of BIPOC representation. The board was still all white, but you could visibly see that the organization did look different. At this point, there was a training on racial identity and racial justice that kicked off and circulated for a few years. There was, again, the ongoing work to diversify event stages, and public moments happened to address issues of racial injustice in the world. They weren't silent about things that were happening in the world, but they were proactive in communicating about it. And then there was also a lot of work done to start cultivating honest dialogue about racial difference within the staff team. Because it wasn't enough to say, hey, public, we care about this, if the team didn't have the skills to talk about it in a way that was real. Fast forward 4 years, the staff and community, there was a drop in BIPOC representation, but they did add their first BIPOC board member. My theory, no one's told me this, but my theory is that there was a decline in BIPOC representation. And for those who don't know, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, I think there was a decline due to burnout and fatigue for the BIPOC community members. I think that the few years between 2015 and 2019 were just really exhausting to participate in all of these trainings and to be giving all this advice and direction. And so I think people said, I'm done, I gotta go be in a place that's actually nourishing to me. I can't keep leading this change in our community. So the trainings paused because there weren't enough leaders of color to facilitate them. And then at the same time, public-facing communications about race became more normal. So the community was used to seeing it. Used to seeing celebrations of Black History Month, used to seeing real engagement with issues of racial injustice in our city. And I think that was a positive shift in the culture, especially as compared to 2012, where no one talked about it. And then to relatively present, I guess this was last year, 2021, it looks way different over the course of 10 years. The staff is about 40% BIPOC now. The community is at about 25%. And then the board, 30% BIPOC on the board, and then also, what did I say, 40% female. So that was a pretty big shift if we go back looking at 2012 to today. The community had ongoing trainings on racial identity, justice, and even getting into like understanding white supremacy and all of these cultural norms, like a lot more heavy lifting than before, which is huge. A diversity task force was created and mobilized. And then there's, again, this ongoing work to diversify event stages and public-facing things. And so it took a long time to get to where they are today. And I think if you talk to anyone there, they would say, we still have a long way to go. So leaders are often asking, how long does this journey really take, if we're being honest? And according to Dr. Darnisa Amante Jackson, it can take a community 8 to 10 years to move from diversity to the base of the iceberg, where we're talking equity and liberation. And so I think this is helpful to give us a perspective that's realistic. If leaders started thinking about DEI in 2020, then they're not at equity and justice yet. They can't get there. It takes too long. And so I just like to offer this up as, hey, here's where you might be if you started this work 2 years ago versus 10 to 20 years ago. It takes a long time. I will also say, though, if you start a new organization with priorities at the base of the iceberg, you're likely to skip a lot of steps because it's a priority from the beginning. You're not having to backtrack. So here's a roadmap that I offer up for organizations. It's really helpful to determine your frame, like to determine the frame that's real for you as a person, and then what's real for your organization. Sometimes I find that DEI leaders, we might be operating at the base of the iceberg, but the people we're working with are really just at the top. And so it takes some time to figure out what's realistic in our context. I think it's helpful to create a guiding statement, just to have a clear, team-wide, agreed upon perspective on, hey, here's what we're going after and why. And then number 3 is to choose your vehicle. Maybe it's just one, maybe it's multiple. I tend to recommend one depending on your context. Operate that vehicle for 6 to 12 months. You gotta try it out for long enough to see if it works. And then create feedback loops to evaluate. So it's not a very sexy process. It's actually pretty simple. Like pick something, try it, see how it goes, start again. But this is one way to help move forward if you're trying to instigate change in your context. So here are a few discussion questions that I have for all of you. So you can talk about these around your table, and then we've got a few more minutes. And then you can ask me any questions as well. But the first question is, which of these 3 frames is home base for you personally? When you think of your own life and leadership, where are you? And then which desired outcome brought you to this session? So when you're thinking about your organization, what are you hoping is possible for where you are and what you lead? The next question is, which of these 3 frames has guided your DEI efforts in your organization or sphere of influence? And then what's worked, what hasn't worked? And then lastly, what do you currently believe to be in the realm of possibility for your organization? So you might not have time to get to all of these questions, but I wanted to create a moment for you to talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll land the plane here. So yeah, circle up with the people who are near you and dive in. All right, let's bring it back together. We only have about 5 more minutes with one another. Let's bring it back together. So I'd love to hear just any observations, reflections, point of tension. Just I'd love to hear a little bit of feedback from you. What are you thinking? How does this land? Is it helpful? Did you know it all already? Like what's happening at your tables? I'd love to hear from you. And it can be in response to these specific questions, or it can just be something that came up in the conversation that you were having.
I'll go.
Yes, please.
We spoke a little bit about all of our unique experiences in our different places, and it was just kind of like the myriad of like what we're going through. Some of us are on the spectrum of like, we could all relate to being exhaustive about being that one leader or person of color and having to represent what that means and the weight of that type of responsibility. And then I also shared moving into a different space where I'm not the only person of color anymore, but now I'm like, well, I wonder what we're missing because we don't have so many different representations
Yes.
amongst our team. And it made me want to ask you, I guess, what do we do in that instance when you are an organization specifically targeting a person like we focus on Black and Brown youth? How do we maintain diversity, inclusion, and equity and justice when we are trying to liberate a very specific targeted group of people?
So how do you keep all the different intersections of identity in mind on your team when you're focused on one group? Well, I think it's interesting because even within Black and Brown communities, there's so much diversity, like an endless amount of diversity as well. I am pro having as much diverse representation, even beyond race, within a team so that you're better equipped, I think, to serve a community of people. So whether we're thinking in terms of sexual orientation or gender or age, the more you're able to, I don't know what your role is in this organization or this company, but the more you're able to have that representation on your team, the better. I also think it's important in general for organizations to have some sort of feedback loop from the community they're serving about what they need. And I think that is a really good anchor point for making those decisions about who to go find. Is it that the youth are saying, hey, we really need to better understand this or that, or we want to be exposed to this or that. I think listening to who you're trying to serve would probably be the best place to start in terms of determining what your makeup of your team might need to be beyond just race and ethnicity. So you're probably already doing that, but that's my thought in response to your question. Yeah.
So we also talked about, we also talked about being like a Black leader. You're taking over an organization that wasn't previously Black. Well, actually, it was like your 2012 case study. But now you're the Black leader. Now the expectation and the weight is that, at least something I've heard that came up at our table was that because you are the Black leader, now you're at the table. You're now responsible for getting everybody else that's Black at the table.
Yeah. That's hard.
Like what? So, I mean, you gotta take your 3 seconds, take your deep breath, and like get to the reality of like unpacking what all does that mean.
Yeah.
So it's just it's great to have a Black leader and be in that position, be the Black leader at the table, but sometimes you want to actually leave the table
Yes.
because of the weight
Yes.
of just the weight that your peers put on you and the expectation like you're supposed to change everything in the Black agenda
Wow.
or have a Black agenda.
Sure. Yeah. And I would imagine that as the leader, it's really difficult to have other peers be held accountable for that change. Like, it's not just me, y'all. This is a collective, and y'all were here first. So what are you going to do? Tell me your agenda. That's what I want to know.
I love what you talked about, Beth.
Thanks, Jerome.
I'm biased, y'all. I've known Bethany's work for 8 years. If you haven't read her book, get her book. She talks fast because she's brilliant, but she wrote it all down for you. The interesting thing, one of the things I was thinking through, Bethany, especially with the reparation piece, is that oftentimes we think reparation is just financial. But the thing that happens clinically that I find really interesting is when I have somebody in the BIPOC community sitting in front of me
that's a really powerful question.
So that's what makes me, that's what's running through my head as you ask these questions.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Jerome. And we'll go here, and you'll be, I think, our last one. Yeah.
I guess my question would be, can you offer up any advice for those of us who are in leadership as African Americans or Black, and leading a team that's diverse, but yet at the same time, with I guess, let me just use my job as an example. So I'm on a team and we have like 3 other African American women, right? But because we are Black, it's always that, oh, you guys are cliquish,
Sure.
or that we have to work extra hard in order for people to understand our level of work, not knowing what we come in with already, and then our job is already hard. So when they look at us, it's like, okay, it's almost to the fact that we have to prove something every day. And
Yeah.
so that's where the burnout is.
Yes.
That we're constantly, me myself, working in a company, in an organization where I'm so passionate about the mission, and yet no one sees me because of my color.
Yes.
And yet I'm educated, and yet I'm coming from homelessness, and yet I am a single mom, and I'm struggling like these moms, so they connect with me,
Yep.
but they don't see that because they just see my skin. So it's like you're overlooked. So yeah, we're burning out.
Yes.
Because we're working in multiple places in our organization and working multiple jobs. And our teachers and program director, myself, I'm working in the kitchen, I'm in the office, I'm teaching in the classroom, and I'm burnt out. And so our other teachers are burning out because we're working extra hard to prove to others that we belong here.
Right.
So what should we do?
Oh, my goodness. I'm underqualified to respond to that question adequately. But I just what I keep wondering is, what does support look like for you? That's one. But then it's also hard because you don't want to have to be tasked with going to get the support you need, because that's another job. But that's what my heart was saying. I was like, oh, who's supporting you, and where is that network for you? Because I do think I spend a lot of time trying to get other people to change, and that doesn't really get me very far. Like, I want you to be less harmful. I want you to be less microaggressive or whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's not really my work. My work, especially as a Black woman, is to take care of myself as best I can so that I can show up to the most important people. And that has been its own process and journey of learning and healing. And so I'm like, how do we help? Like, where do I send the casserole? Because that's a lot to carry. So figuring out what's yours to carry versus what someone else's is what comes to mind for me in response to you, not as an answer, but as a response. Yeah. Yeah. I think we're done, but I'm like, we could talk all day. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to meet after, we just have a session right after this, if you're open to that.
Good, I'm here.
Awesome. Bethany, thank you so much. That was awesome.